Casey, should I start?
Yes, you can go ahead and start.
Okay. So today's session is Approaches to Native Language Instruction. My name is Delphine Redshirt, and I teach at Stanford University. I teach in the language department. Here at Stanford, we have an area called Special Languages. And so currently there are 5 Native American languages taught here at Stanford University. I'm not sure if they're unusual in that, but they teach also, there are other instructors teaching Cherokee, Navajo, Lakota, and the Hawaiian language. And on and off, I think there's a Quechua indigenous language instruction. So that is the department I teach under. It is in special languages. It's not just Native American languages. It's also other less spoken languages in the United States. So I think other languages like the Vietnamese language or what students are interested in. So that is the department I've been teaching under. And I'll go ahead and begin the session.
You can go to the next slide.
Okay, so I want to introduce myself in my language, which is Lakota, Delphine Redshirt Imachiapi, na Malakota na Pine Ridge Reservation Hemachiataha, na Lil Stanford University Lil Wablawa, Wablawa Shni, Lil Washichama, na Lil Wana Wanietu, Wikchemna Sam Isam Almania to Yamani Washicham Cha Le Ampetiki Punkashila Chetkia Chantewashtia Wagavake Chahecho Wana Wachichaka. My name is Delphine Redshirt, and I am from the Pine Ridge Reservation. I'm an enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux tribe. My grandparents, my paternal parents are also from the Rosebud Sichaho tribe, so I have relatives on both reservations. They don't allow dual citizenship, or I would like that. A lot of our teachings come from our family Sichaho side, so we are descendants of the Winter Count Keeper family, Batiste Good. And so from the Rosebud side, there's that rich heritage. And then on the Pine Ridge side, Oglala side, there's the Redshirt Table, which is a small village, and also all the descendants and relatives that live there. I've been teaching here at Stanford University for 13 years. I began teaching here in language because they were seeking a teacher, and I just stayed. And so what I'll share with you today is what I've developed. So it's a model that just from the ground up, just working with students, with the university, and then just being exposed to other language teachers. I want to mention a teacher whose work I followed. He had been teaching since 1983. His name is Albert Whitehat. Albert has passed on, but it is his orthography. If I use orthography, his methods that I use. I just want to mention that informally. Lakota, and as we talk about the language, I'll mention the differences between the dialects. But the session goal today is to provide a basic model for Indigenous language instruction. So I wanted to just kind of take an informal poll, just so I would know what to focus on the most. So I'll present 2 models. One is as a first language speaker, which is the model I use. I rely on it subconsciously, just switching over my thoughts. I started thinking in English when I entered the military. I entered as a freshman in pre-med, Regis University. You can see it on my biography. I spent a year and a half in pre-med, and then it just got too difficult. And so I stopped out for over a year and joined the military. So I'm a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. But in that training, I think I stopped thinking in my language. So now I think primarily in English, especially teaching students at this level at a university. It's very challenging sometimes. I don't always catch the nuances of English. I try very hard, but my main go-to comforting language is Lakota. So when I switch back to that, I know I'm teaching relying or basically using that as a crutch, that I know this language inside and out. But I want to also provide a second model for you. Pine Ridge, a lot of the language instruction immersion programs are taught by second language teachers. So I'm also very aware of that. I have evaluated programs, and so I can kind of focus on that. So when the time comes, it's really for me to focus in this session on providing you with the best information on what kind of model would work for you, or what may help you in your efforts to teach the language. The session objectives, again, identifying these two models of instruction, and then some sample lessons just to kind of get started. And also that understand, as I've indicated, how skills, language, and culture, you cannot separate them. So language equals culture, culture equals language. And that the two are, once again, if your cultural heritage language is your second language, it would also be good to kind of get instruction in cultural protocol. So an example would be the Hawaiian language. I have students not in my language class, but I also teach in Native American Studies, which is what my doctorate is in. And there I have many Indigenous students, all from different tribes here at Stanford. And Hawaiian students tell me or share with me their protocol in their language. And they're second language learners. But it's good to know that what is important to your culture. A lot of the time, the starting point is oral tradition stories. So embedded in the instruction always is culture, and you just can't separate the two. At the end of the session, I'll ask you to kind of reflect on language instruction, and then the one thing that's very, very difficult is assessment. Not from the perspective of the instructor, because I think when you get to a certain level as an instructor, and maybe even as a new instructor, you know you've been assessed throughout your time in education or higher education. So assessment isn't the problem. It's working with students and balancing between assessment and encouragement. And so I think we can kind of talk about that when we get to that point. So the two types of, the two models that I will present to you, two types of instruction. The first one is as a first language speaker, as an instructor. So again, as I mentioned, up through my first year as a freshman, I heard Lakota. I grew up in a family where that was the first language. The small community I was from, it was also the first language. Our grandfather, who was 97 when he died, spoke the language, completely refused the English language. So we had to learn words for something as simple as items of clothing, socks. And so as a first language speaker, I really, as an instructor, I'm constantly, as I mentioned before, thinking through two sorts of two lenses, one from my upbringing and the second one from just really struggling with the second language. For me, that's English. I don't think I'll ever be fully fluent in English, but so I understand the struggles. And also teaching at an internationally well-known university like Stanford, a lot of the students come from foreign countries. Sometimes I get students from other countries in my classes, and English is their second language. Then I really try to work with them as well. So first language speaker, a lot of experience in second language speaking or instruction. So I think these two types of instruction will give you some sort of basic understanding as to what the challenges might be. I wanted to take an informal poll at this time. So if you would just take a few minutes and read the two questions and answer them, and then we'll move on.
And just to clarify, sorry about the confusion. Yes, would be first language. No would be second. Okay, thank you all for participating. So it looks like about half and half.
Okay. So that helps me kind of try to focus on what would be most helpful to you as participants. It looks like over 70% and it would be interesting to know what you hope to take from this session. But let's go ahead and look at the lock of the language. So if you look at the language families, Siouan language is one of the larger ones. And you can see here kind of where similar languages are spoken. So the way I teach, so I also teach in Native American studies, I teach Native American history. So what we see at the time of contact, so at the time of 1492, and that's kind of where Native American history begins. But for Native people, it started 200 years before that. So around the year 1200, there were two major civilization areas in the US. One was here in the Southwest in Chaco Canyon, and that collapsed 200 years before Columbus arrived. And over here, right outside the area now known as St. Louis, is the Cahokian Mounds. And so the mounds were also like a large metropolitan area in this area of the US, again, 200 years before Columbus arrived. So these civilizations flourished in these areas in the Southwest and then here in the Midwest. And for some unknown reason, those civilizations collapsed. Current Pueblos, the Pueblo cultures in the Southwest, tie their ancestry to Chaco Canyon. The same way as a lot of the Missouri River tribes can basically tied to a common area. All of these languages are somewhat related. In my dissertation work, I always say Dakota is the mother language. That is, that's the main language. Everything seems to come from Dakota. These other areas down here, all the way maybe to where St. Louis is now, these, and if you go north, there are smaller reservations currently. The Osage, their word for God is Wakanda. Our word for God is Wakantanka. There are similar words. I'm not familiar with Osage, but I'm sure there are other words. Here, as you go closer to what is now present day Omaha, Nebraska, the peoples along here, the Omaha Ponca and the Winnebago, I was fortunate enough to attend an Omaha powwow a couple of years ago. And one of the elders was talking about the word Nebraska, its origins, the word Nablaska. Nablaska to the Omaha is a flat land. For the Lakota, Dakota people, Blaska means flat. And so when the elder said Nablaska, I immediately recognized similar language. And there are other, and I had always known this, but finding those similarities, I think, is even more important today, because I think we can share teaching methods all along this area, along the Missouri River. So here is Lakota. Again, the mother language appears to be Dakota. Here up in Canada, we know from history that a lot of Sitting Bulls people had fled after the times of conflict. And so those Dakota speakers often come back and participate in language conferences that are held in Rapid City, South Dakota. So Nakota is their dialect. I've heard people from Pine Ridge tell me that they've had conversations. It's very difficult to understand, but it's basically, and as we go through orthography and that, you'll see what the differences are. But this is the language Lakota that I speak. I have a son-in-law who speaks Dakota. I always say to my daughter, well, he has a language impediment, but we can understand each other. It's just that slight difference. So the language family again is Siouan, and that includes a lot of other smaller language groups. It's phonetic, so you can kind of through linguistics identify the parts of the mouth. With beginning students, I don't really do that unless they're having trouble. Then we kind of resort to explaining it more along with these places of articulation. But it might be a good place for a beginning language student to start talking about that. The English phonetic alphabet can be used to represent these sounds. Currently, there's a sort of many different orthographies for Lakota. Many of them are very confusing. And so as we go through this, I'll mention it. But I think I mentioned Albert Whitehat's orthography. I think is probably the simplest. The language itself, again, just using linguistic terms, in thinking about the time that we have, I think some of the things I can point out here, in Lakota, we do not use the D or R sound. And so in Dakota, they don't use the L sound. I'm not sure if they use the R sound. but these are basically the sounds that you will not find in the Lakota language. There's also no V sound, and we also do not use the letter F or V or D or R. And so the sounds that are often used by linguists, orthography is used to represent these sounds are ones here where you see the SH sound or the CH sound or the Z sound. And so some of the sounds, I think for non-speakers are problematic. For a first language speaker, it's easier just to use the phonetic alphabet. Why you would use sort of linguistic analysis. So during my doctoral work at Arizona, I took a linguistics class, graduate linguistics class, just to get some background. And I would recommend that for anyone thinking about their heritage language. Language learning is sort of helped along with linguistics. But I think in teaching the language, sometimes pure linguistics presents a problem. So just sort of even the places of articulation, you begin to kind of really understand that if you have some general background or an introductory course in linguistics, which is what I was able to do. And a lot of that is just pattern recognition. So like mathematics, we were introduced in that graduate level class to Swahili or other languages and given a set of instructions on how to analyze them, and mainly looking for the patterns in language. And we know that now that computer programs sort of mimic us by seeking patterns and things as well. So linguistic analysis. And the second thing I wanted to emphasize is grammar. Grammar, every language in the world has its own grammar, yet we don't think that native languages have grammar as well, similar to English or to French or Spanish. But understanding the grammar inherent in your language, I think, is really important. And so identification of the parts of speech are important learning points. And just again, as a first language speaker, I was introduced to the English language. And as I became literate, I was very aware of improper grammar, and that even now, the English I'm speaking isn't the English I speak when I go back to Pine Ridge. My English is less formal. But grammar, I think, is one of those things that we don't really think about in our own native languages. Diacritics, as I mentioned, in the work that I do, I am analyzing writing that was done at the turn of the 20th century. So these Lakota writers were using very minimal marks, and it took me a very long time to really understand this concept of keeping it simple. And it is what I tell my students: use the orthography you think that will help you, but I really emphasize that you keep it simple. And students honor this, and they use the symbols that help them. And so we don't really try to incorporate a lot of orthography. So very simply here, using a dot over the C and S, CH and SH. And now I think they're represented differently with whatever orthography that you're using. The glottal stops, and these are the consonants that most first language learners have trouble with. So just an apostrophe for those glottal stops. And the gutturalized sounds, again, just a dot over those consonants for H, K, P, and T. And that keeps it simple. And then again, the nasal vowels, we have nasal vowels and Lakota, and many times they're represented different ways. But in the old way of representing the language, the letter N was used. Swords orthography, this is my dissertation work, is the work of a man named George Sword. And so he used a Q for that glottal stop, the K with the apostrophe. And then he used R for the guttural H. And so when the first language, English language learners use the English alphabet, for George Sword and others, they use letters that we don't have similar sounds for. So Q is one, R is one. And so they sort of use those letters. And so diacritics, I think, it depends on your teaching methods again. One thing I learned when I was in the military was sort of an acronym that they used to keep things simple, and I still use it. We get too sort of wound up in these complex orthographies. But in Lakota, there is no universally agreed upon orthography. So teaching, again, what fits your best way of teaching. For me, first language speaker, minimal orthography. And this may differ for someone else just learning the language and teaching it as well, which is very common today. There are Lakota language teachers who are just out of college, and they are not only learning as they teach, and for them, orthography becomes very, very important. Phonetic symbols, again, for consonants and vowels. Again, it's the sound of a word that is translated, not the spelling. And so, again, in terms of just the sound and meaning, always, again, just focusing on context as well. So not just providing lists of words, but always teaching that word within the context of grammar, of syntax, within the sentence. What does it mean? And many language teachers and language workbooks, there's a lot of time spent on things like nasals and that. But again, introductory courses, we just basically go through all of the sounds. And I once heard from someone that there are 500 syllables in our Lakota language. And so just to keep that in mind as well. It's a very compact, complex, and highly sophisticated language. This is the first language, the model first language instruction. At the beginning of this session, I had sort of spoke to the facilitator and told her that if you have any questions, just to pose those questions as we go along. So Casey, do you want to clarify that?
Yeah, so y'all are welcome to ask questions at any time. You can put your question in the chat, or you can submit it to the Q&A section. I'm monitoring both. And then Delphine, whenever I see a question, I'll jump in, but nothing right now.
Okay. So as I mentioned, the first language instruction, the first time I was approached here at Stanford, I was very familiar with the Native American Cultural Center here, and a Lakota student, actually a group of students from Pine Ridge and one from Montana, had asked for a language instructor. And at that time, I thought what I've always heard, Just because you know the language, can you teach it? And so that was sort of my stumbling block. I felt I had never been asked to teach the language. Can I do it? And so I experimented with different models in the beginning. My students were very eager. For them, this was just what they had been hoping for. Most of the students were from Kyle or Wombly, South Dakota, which is very isolated from Pine Ridge. If you look at the Pine Ridge Reservation, in earlier versions of the slide, I had mentioned what the land base was. If you look at the state of Rhode Island, basically you could fit it into the size that Pine Ridge is. So most people don't understand the distance from Pine Ridge, the village Pine Ridge. The farther away you are, the more likely you're able to retain language and culture and that. And so these students were from the furthest distance from Pine Ridge, and they really wanted the language. And so when I first began teaching it in 2010, I had students tell me their language goal was to understand what was being taught in ceremony. That for them, they hear Lakota and prayer in ceremony and they couldn't understand. And so I used their language goals and I taught them. They did projects on Inipi, the sweat lodge, or ceremony in general. And so since then, we've gotten away from ceremony. Stanford University does have an Inipi that was used widely in the at the time of Alcatraz in the protest era. And it's been moved since, and I think it's fallen out of use. But the model, first language instruction model has changed. The focus is more on grammar, instruction with grammar. Infused into that is very strongly now oral tradition. And so as I mentioned, each quarter it's modified to meet the language goals of each student. And so it's informally, I have them tell me why they're taking the course. And over the years, I've had non-Lakota students also take the course for their language requirement. So it's 3 quarters, it meets all of the foreign language requirements here at Stanford. So I've had students from Columbia, I've had rural students here in the US, and other students as well. I've had students from other tribes. I think I've had Blackfeet students. And so their language goals are really what run the course for that year, because they have to stay in the course all 3 quarters to get that requirement out of the way. If I look at it that way, usually it's twice a week. The year that I had the Blackfeet students, 2 of them, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Daryl Kipp. Daryl Kipp started an immersion school for the Blackfeet language in Montana. He was a Harvard linguist who went back to his community and started this immersion school. One of my students was from that immersion school. And so that year I was lucky to have it every day, every single day for 45 minutes or something. But generally it's twice a week. That's the teaching schedule. Approximately 60 lessons for each of the 10 weeks. And so there are lessons for each of those. And so the sequence, the basic sequence is starting at an elementary level and in the first 10 weeks, and then we stop and they present what they know. And then the next 10 weeks, we go with the same model, but I add a little bit more complexity. And then at the end of that 10 weeks, they show me what they know. And then finally, at the end of it, more advanced concepts, so with oral tradition techniques and that, and mainly verbs. I'm sure you're aware, most Native American languages are verb-based. In Lakota, there's verbs become extremely complex, but they learn a pattern. And once they know that pattern, they can apply it. But then teaching them things like what is a word is composed of, and having them construct words or break down words so that they can see how different Lakota concepts and complex concepts are just simpler words kind of brought together. So that happens at the end sort of their 10 weeks. I've only taught advanced Lakota in all these years once. And this was a Lakota student who was going into science, and she wanted to use those concepts in an advanced way. So she came back, and then another student joined her, and that was the only time I was able to teach even more advanced concepts. So generally, again, it's a first-year course, and starting very basic at the elementary level, and then moving up as we progress through the academic year here at Stanford. We are given a model, so as with any university, there are guidelines, and so and these are the credit hours given to the students. So 3 hours, 40 minutes a week in classroom instruction. When I was able to teach it every day, 44 minutes a day. And that year I was very lucky that students, and I had 5 students come early in the morning. Well, about 9 o'clock was early for students. And so it seemed the students, and again, in that course, I had 2 students from the Blackfeet Reservation. They seemed to pick it up really fast because it was every day. And so that's something that model I would go back to. With the pandemic, a lot has been interrupted, and it isn't the same before the pandemic and after. A 10-week period, basically the teaching hours and also the work they do outside of class. So as you'll see in assessment, they do have homework for every class. This schedule can be modified for any level of teaching. So ideally, though, I think with immersion schools, they will tell you every day would be a good sort of a good model to follow. Students can test out of the language requirement. Over the decade that I've taught here, no student has tried. I did have one student who was semi-fluent. She was very, very good, and maybe perhaps could have tested out. She chose not to. They can request to be tested. And if so, there are 2 parts to the test, so the written and an oral test, and they have to prove first level proficiency. I've taken sort of some courses in sort of language testing models, and I think this would be very important, not only for students, but as teachers wanting to teach a heritage language, to develop a test for them. Otherwise, it'd be like the blind leading the blind, and more confusion than there is learning. So these tests where you can request to be tested, I really feel that instructors should be tested as well. And there are pros and cons to that. A lot of people feel that tests are testing instructors defeats the purpose. But again, for us in Lakota, I think there's tremendous amounts of confusion because we still have a lot of first language speakers And most of the people teaching on our reservation, a lot of them are second language learners. So if we could just bring the first language speakers into the classroom. This language course, the one taught here at Stanford, emphasizes student involvement, so in learning, so in continuous interaction. So we're constantly moving back and forth, and student involvement is very, very key. Very early on, you know, the way it's developed is basic introductory course. There are no prerequisites. I don't assume that they have any prior knowledge. Some do. Some come in knowing from ceremony at home or from relatives, and so they do come in with some do come in with basic introductory knowledge. My approach to teaching, as I mentioned before, my first sort of stumbling block was I know the language, but can I teach it? And really doubting myself as a teacher. And I think a lot of first language speakers have those similar doubts. But I think if you approach it as a relative, teaching a relative, that may be the best way to kind of approach it. In those communities where you have a lot of first language speakers and they have no classroom experience. For me, helping students learn basic vocabulary words for building conversational skills. We don't spend a lot of time on nouns because Lakota is a verb, intensively verb-based language. With verbs, you can have a whole conversation when you conjugate them. Grammar and syntax is very, very important. A lot of the students that come into the course from high school level language courses in Lakota don't know how to construct a sentence. And so we also focus on that. We learn simple sentence construction. In later parts of the academic year, they learn more complex, but many times they figure that out for themselves by the end of the first quarter. They know how to construct complex sentence, they just don't trust themselves. So there is a lot of learning going on as we move from the first quarter to the end. The 4 language skills that are really important are reading, writing, speaking, and listening. So listening is, in a classroom setting, really, really emphasized. And it's not just me, it's the students speaking the language to each other, and so we can hear it. Audiovisual materials, student presentations, role play, collaborative learning. There are many different techniques. And so in linguistics, you learn some of these in endangered language sorts of classes or websites, or you can learn what works for your students. And primarily we have this little exercise we do in the classroom. It's called checking in. And so they ask each other, how are you? And there are 4 different ways to answer. And so after a while, it's memorization, but they do know that they are asking each other, how are you? Subconsciously, they may say, I'm having a difficult time, and maybe they are. Or they'll say, I'm having a good day, or everything is going well. So whatever works in the classroom, I think just introducing to you what is possible at this basic level is really important. Facilitating meaningful learning experiences with cultural elements. The one student that I had who maybe could have tested out of the language requirement, she went even a step further in asking students how they are in that checking in exercise. She would mimic sort of facial expressions if they're having a terrible day. she would show them with her face how empathetic she was. And so you can think of kind of the exercises that would work for kindergartners all the way up through high school, or for even university level students. These are the language instruction course objectives that are on every syllabus. So grammar, basic grammar structures. The only Lakota grammar book that we have had gone out of print in 1939, and basically just reprints of that. But if there's a grammar for your language, it's very helpful to know. Reading, so basic comprehension, just even text that they compile. And in the beginning, when I first started the course, we first began with ceremony, and then next we worked at developing first reader projects. I had been fortunate to visit an immersion program in Manderson, South Dakota, and I noticed that the teacher was constructing her own text for young students. And so we developed all of these first readers in the Lakota language. Unfortunately, we weren't able to share them because of copyright restrictions. But there are maybe oral tradition stories that you can work with. Writing, again, constructing simple sentences, and that's the emphasis. Simple dialogues, introducing yourself, checking in, and also identifying objects in their college, university rooms, or outside their window, and asking each other, what do you see in your room? I see my quilt, or just having simple conversations around that. Directions, giving directions, and that using something like the total physical response, so using your hands to motion and showing them where to sit, and that giving directions. They do that as well. So just to say walk, and then they keep walking, say stop, turn around, and those kinds of directions that work in the classroom. Share descriptions of self and others in their introduction of themselves. Where the cultural lessons really come in is in oral tradition. So telling stories, how our history is passed on, how really important oral tradition is. And then their final project. Listening and comprehension. So again, identifying main ideas using simple texts. Now, at the end of over a decade, I use primarily oral tradition texts. There's no copyright issues. These stories belong to the Lakota people. That is what I was taught. The technique used by the elders when they tell these stories is this is what we are told. And so we focus on oral tradition. And many of them are translated into English. Sometimes, if we can, we work with those texts and we translate them back into Lakota. There's a difference between dialogue and conversation versus description. And so the students learn that as well, and that how that occurs in oral tradition. In the end, when we talk about assessment, at the end of 10 weeks, the students also evaluate each other in their final projects. And so I've developed a form for that. I also here at Stanford taught in the program in writing and rhetoric, which is an amazing program. It's for freshmen or transfer students, and it's basically writing skills. So using some of the techniques I've learned there, the students evaluate each other and they listen, so they make comments about pronunciation or that, and they're able to help each other. These are the instruction materials that I use. And so a good basic dictionary is always very helpful for any language teacher. For us, this one, Father Beagle spoke to many Lakota first language speakers when he compiled his dictionary. Sort of the oral tradition stories around Father Beagle was that he started out in a language, he started his language learning with children because he was in charge with getting children to school from a boarding school. And he noted that they listen more if he used the language. And so he kept a little notebook and he would write Lakota words in there like wash your face or comb your hair. And in that he became fluent in the language. When outside, he would ask students, what's the name of that bird or a plant? And so I find that his dictionary is, there are little examples of conversational Lakota embedded in there. And so for me, it's just a sort of a compilation of how Lakota was spoken at Pine Ridge. So how the Oglala people spoke it. There are other dictionaries for the Rosebud tribe, Sitahu. And so for me, this is what works. The Dakota verb book is very useful. Sometimes it can be confusing to Lakota students when they use it because everything is in the D dialect or the Dakota dialect. When that confusion arises, though, we look at the word and then we kind of see what consonants were replaced by Lakota consonants were replaced by Dakota consonants. And again, just trying to keep it simple and not complex. The grammar is really important too. In a given year, in the first 10 weeks, there's very little other material. As we move forward, though, we kind of look at other work as well, especially in oral tradition stories. Before I go into the second language instruction, are there any questions?
Lester did mention something in the chat about, so when you're talking about teaching the language or your approach to teaching the language, is that specifically with non-native learners, or how might you approach it with students who know the language to a certain extent? Or I guess, how do you differentiate?
I think for them, they usually provide sort of a biography or why I want to take this course. And also, one of the exercises in the course is when we learn about kinship is providing a sort of a family tree. And so from that, you can kind of see how much of the language they've been introduced to by relatives. But primarily, many of them are, it is their language. And so whether they grew up in an urban setting, whether one parent is of a different culture. I've had a student whose father was Spanish, and so learning the Spanish language and then the Lakota language. And so it comes from the students themselves, their sharing of that knowledge. I've had one student who eventually went to work for NPR, who was not native, but had been introduced to the Arabic language. She was a rural student from the Midwest. She was not Arabic, but she was interested in languages. So it really depends. But as I mentioned, starting with their language goals, that's the beginning point. I think if you're in a classroom setting, you know your students, and you begin by just having them introduce themselves. What do you hope to learn from this class? So it could be both, people who have some working knowledge, who may have heard some in ceremony, some language, or people who just have had no prior experience. So, and I've taught in the classroom some of those students. So I hope that answers your question. Currently, there are no college level textbooks, so targeted at law teaching and learning Lakota. So many of the instructors pull together different resources. I always like to first start to say that one of the greatest influence in my teaching was Albert Whitehat. He again, his orthography was within the last 5 years adopted by the Sichafu in Rosebud. So that is the orthography that they use. What I wanted to present as the second language instruction model is from the tribal college. So initially, I think as I began to teach Lakota, I was aware of their program. One of my cousins from Red Shirt Table was their instructor at the tribal college. He and I would have these conversations. Well, how do you represent the guttural sound and ultimately just the dot over the consonant? So very informal conversations. But again, I was very aware of it. I was able to obtain a copy of their workbook, which is what I use for this session. And so I provide this information for you. And these lessons were developed under a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. And it's very interesting that it was tied to the local radio station. So we have a radio station called Kili, and it airs a lot of programs, especially in the early morning hours to Lakota speakers. And it's also very sports oriented. Sports are very important on the reservation at the high school level. And so Kili Radio is listened to by the community. But in 1983, it was started on the reservation. And so it was very closely around the beginnings of the radio, beginnings of the time that the radio first started operating, that these lessons were also aired on the radio. So it provides us with an example of how to structure languages, and a great resource for anyone are tribal colleges. And I noticed that the keynote speaker before this session is currently one of the not contributors, but maybe facilitators of texts that the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, AHEC, is putting together on Lakota text. And so tribal colleges are a great resource, I think, for language learning and language teaching. Here, as we can see, OLC has been doing this for a few decades. In their manual, there are 15 lessons taught. And I also want to note that it's a public tribal land grant community college. So, and there are several in the US. And here again, Pine Ridge, the population, many other members. In my family alone, we don't live on the reservation for employment reasons. But again, the square, you can just see the actual size of the reservation when you compare it to a small state like Rhode Island. The language instruction model, the student manual, again, it provides a strong beginning section on history. So a lot of it is just military history with the US, which is what is very common for most Native American history. And so the first lesson that you see in there are the sounds, Lakota sounds, an introduction kind of similar to what you heard, but we'll take a look at one sample lesson for this session. Greetings and introductions, and gender and speech patterns. In Lakota, we have to differentiate between the genders. We have what are called gender endings, and I'll talk about that. A lot of time, a lot of lessons are spent on the kinship system. And I think this is common also for most Native American cultures, is the idea of the importance of kinship. Here there is this focus on the immediate family and then the extended family. So, and this is cultural learning. So the immediate family is sort of the inner circle, and then the extended family is what we call a Tioshpaye. So a lot of time at the college, at the tribal college language in the course, they spend time on the kinship system. Then I think a lot of the teaching then sort of halts, that is a cultural teaching. And so what we then have are just labeling. Lesson 6, the 5 senses. I don't really spend a lot of time on that. So what I have in common with the first lessons, the sounds are very important. Greetings, introductions, protocols are very important. Gender and speech patterns, of course, the kinship system. And so these first 5 lessons are very key to providing a really strong foundation. The second set of lessons are more what you would find in maybe first reader books, or just a basically even learning a language. If I were looking at a third language and I was trying to learn Spanish, even learning gender nouns and things like that. So these lessons 6 through 10, I think, are just labels or nouns. 5 senses, communications, lesson 7, giving and following directions, time, days of the week, and that, and then the months and seasons. I do see some cultural lessons in this, which is lesson 9, the concept of time. We as Native Americans have learned European time, and we really focus on European time. It's what we use to get by in the mainstream world. But the concept of time prior is very different. And so many times I have to remind students of that. The concept of time for our culture is very different from the European concept of time. And so are the months and seasons. So for us, if you look at the 2 civilizations that I started this session out with, at Chaco Canyon, the indigenous people there had a way to measure all the different phases of the moon and the seasons. They were very sophisticated in their knowledge. Also at Cahokia Mounds, they had what was called Woodhenge. So it was similar to Stonehenge in that they constructed this this site that could measure all of the seasons that were occurring. So the equinox and the different seasons as they occurred. So I see really important lessons in 9 and 10 where you could infuse culture, and these differ. There's no general concept of time, Native American time, stereotypically or not. Many different diversity of tribes, all of our concepts of time are different, as how we keep track of the seasons. months is arbitrary, but I think seasons are what we focus on. So for the tribal college lessons, there are cultural lessons as well. Most of it, as you can see, with color. We don't use, I don't usually teach these color, money, foods, or animals, so lessons 11 through 14, but within context of what the students select to learn about which oral tradition, creation story, whatever it is that they want to learn. So within context, we learn color or food or the names of animals. But for the tribal college curriculum, they do have focus on these. And these might be really good for K through 12. And then lastly, they do a review of lessons. So you can go back and look at all of the lessons that you've gone through prior. So these are for second language instruction. As I mentioned, I'm not sure what the percentages are, but most of the teachers within the classrooms are second language learners. And only within the last decade, maybe prior to the pandemic, some of these teachers at Pine Ridge were first language learners. So I was very comfortable with the fact that language is being taught along those lines. And now there is this sort of influx of second language instruction. And it becomes a little bit more problematic. You kind of have to sift through what teaching methods are used. So the tribal, a good resource, I think generally a safe resource might be your tribal college if they are teaching your language. Any questions or comments?
I don't
sounds
see
like-
any questions. We do have about 5 minutes.
Okay, so let me just go through a sample lesson and we'll kind of look at that. So listening to sound and meaning, identity formation, introducing yourself in your language, kinship, knowing who your relatives are, orthography and writing and reading, cultural teaching infused into each lesson, and then lastly, assessment and encouragement. So I'll try to get to assessment. So again, the sounds of the language, correct gender, speech patterns, and then just developing the basic skills. Pronunciation is a problem, and I think it's still a problem for me in the English language. So never a problem in the classroom, just encouraging students. Lesson 1 in comparing the models at the tribal college level is just the basic vowels or consonants. As a first language learner, I can kind of look at the difference in those sounds and explain them to students. So what is a basic lesson can turn into more of a comprehensive lesson, even though it's at the elementary level. So again, the introduction to the alphabet, and then just even the explanations all lumped into one, not as students are ready to learn them, but the lessons are all there. And sometimes recording is provided with those lessons. Within the classroom, the students can practice the sounds, and then we explain the special vowels and consonants as we come to them in the classroom. Again, the advantages, the student can listen to the recording again. The disadvantages, there's no immediate feedback. Within the classroom, you can practice, and many times if I listen to them and then I'll say this one word, and we'll focus on the word where the pronunciation, maybe there was a special consonant that wasn't easy for them. introducing themselves. In the tribal college manual, they give you just a basic introduction. In the courses here, we even do a land acknowledgement. And so for the first maybe few 2 or 3 weeks, students have this on a sheet of paper and they read it. As we progress to the end of the quarter, they say it without any assistance. So again, the advantages, the disadvantage, memorization. For the tribal college model, the student can listen to a recording, and again, there's no immediate feedback. Gender, this is a whole lesson in itself. The gender endings. In Lakota, there are no pronouns or indicators for men or women in people or objects and nouns. For the tribal college model, this is often explained without any real sort of context, so it could be confusing. And still a little bit on gender. Lakota, again, is one of those languages where it falls into this category. So, and for the time that we have, I will just indicate that at the very basic level, we just learn them as endings, gender endings, we call them. Here, again, we use a few gender endings, and then as we move forward to more complex ways of introducing gender in the verbs, that's when it's clearer to the students. For the tribal college model, again, they introduce everything at once, but there could be confusion, especially in the way that it's introduced. So generally, in comparing the models, in-person instruction is very, very important. And the student manual is helpful if used in conjunction with in-person instruction. So in today's learning environment using Zoom or a format like this, maybe language teaching can occur in different ways. Lastly, in assessment, this is one way. So just the students know how they're assessed. So this is on their syllabus, class participation, self-introduction, and that. And then greetings, and that. Every class there is homework, and also in-class discussions. And so just watching students and interacting with them, and throughout just the competency in the 4 language skills. Vocabulary items, so tasks specific to the text is selected. For students, it helps them improve self-expression. And then again, every day there is work. Anything worthwhile takes work. And so the students are expected to come to class. Their homework is sometimes handwritten, that's fine, as long as it's there. Some students, it's difficult. Homework is very difficult. But after the first quarter, they begin to kind of keep up with the rest of the class. And again, these are ways of kind of assessing them. And lastly, one of the things we really focus on is listening. And so listening to narratives, and there are provided examples as well throughout. So we take examples from other classes and they can see what students from prior classes have done. Encouraging them, rewarding proficiency, and using culture. So we also have throughout the quarter like a traditional dinner, and getting the students together, and this creation of a language-rich environment. So we have speakers, We have a Dakota speaker who lives in the Bay Area come and speak to the class. At our traditional dinners, we invite area community members, adults to come. We know that with Native students, there are different learning styles. So really encouraging that as well. You know, just assessing your students and seeing how they learn best and trying to motivate them. Trying new technology. Sometimes they're introduced to music, art, whatever's going on culturally. And so the students engage within the Native community as well. Motivating them, challenging them. For me, it's that self-introduction in Lakota. That's a key lesson. So they do this when they get together in the larger Native American environment. They can introduce themselves in their language. If they attend a conference or some other public event, they're able to introduce themselves. They know what to do. And for them, it's an affirmation of their identity. So, and I'll stop here, but I just wanted for a discussion to find out if you're a language teacher, what type of assessment techniques you use, and what type of assessment do you find helpful. For me, it's actually listening to them translate a short oral tradition story. And the way they tell it is their own way. There's no correct way of telling an oral tradition story. So whatever they infuse into it is their addition to it, and it's theirs after the class is over. So that's one way that they're assessed. They have to read it in the language or to be able to tell it in the language. So there's a lot of assessment going on just in that one project.
Okay, so we do have a couple of questions that have come up that I will read out loud. And then if anyone thinks of some ideas as far as type of instruction or assessment that you use that you want to share, feel free to put that in the chat as well. At 2:35, the roundtable rooms do open up. Just to give everyone a heads up, we will be wrapping up here in a little bit, but I do want to make sure that we get to y'all's questions. So the first question we have is, have you worked with apprentices? If so, may you share any language apprenticeship techniques or models?
I have not, because I also teach in the Native American Studies program. And those courses are, so I teach one course in language, and then I teach one in Native American Studies. So for time, and also here at the university, students are not allowed to audit courses. You have to be sort of registered in that class. And so I really have not had that. Although school just opened up on the Rosebud Reservation, and one of my former students is working there, and he's asked me to come and evaluate or visit the program in this coming summer. So when I go, I have a feeling I'll become sort of a consultant, informal consultant to my former student. So there I may have that kind of situation come up. But currently, as an academic, just working alone in the classroom, in both capacities as a language teacher and then as a Native Studies teacher who teaches history and gender studies. I teach a course called Is Pocahontas a Myth? And it's mostly about Native American women's history. And so there are many challenges. Otherwise, I would be glad to engage in sort of an apprenticeship program.
Awesome. Thank you. And then our other question is, if a tribal language is not offered at your college or institution, what are ways to work with a tribe to provide a language class?
I think that currently there's so much information available out there. I know for a while, Yale University had an endangered language fund. And I actually was given, I received the fund in 2004 to publish my second book, which was a translation project. And so finding out through those programs here at the University of California, they have a very large Native American, mostly California languages. I have a feeling they have quite a bibliography as well. So tying into a local university, I know at the University of South Dakota, that system also has a lot of information. They have an oral history center. So tying into local universities or colleges to see what they have, it would require doing some research. And then working with the language, whether there's funding available, and obtaining funds to help develop the program. So I think there are ways to start and encourage your tribe. I know this spring, the Native American Cultural Center here at Stanford brought a linguist from the Miami language. So the Miami are in Oklahoma. We pronounce it Miami, but there's actually a whole language that this young linguist is awakening. He's teaching the language. And so there are many resources available. And I think that linguist teaches at UCLA. But there are ways to ask people who are basically from the ground up starting the language programs.
Awesome. Okay. Okay, and then we will answer this one last question and then send y'all out to roundtables. If you want to go ahead and go to roundtables, you're welcome to go. The last question is, what are your top 3 favorite language programs, whether it's during the summer, throughout the year, or in between?
I think for me, I used to attend a language conference in Rapid City tied to the language conference, the education conference there, which is tied to a basketball tournament in Rapid City. And I used to like to go to that because I could see community members, I could participate in that. But now I realize with my doctoral work, I have to finish a project. I've have most of the language. I prefer working with Lakota first, and now I have to translate it into English. And so that has replaced sort of my community work is knowledge production. So now, as quote unquote an expert, I'm now involved in my own saving the language in the way I know best, which is translating material that has not been prior translated into accessible language for future generations. So that has become my favorite activity. I think it's what AHEC is trying to, the American Indian Higher Education Consortium is trying to do with this text that they provided a list for us, for all the language speakers to try to translate into English. And so translation work of lesser known text into English, so future generations of Lakota speakers have access to it. That's been kind of what I've focused on, and I find really, really important. But also the third thing is my own family. When family members, even my spouse, they say, I want to learn the language. We pray every day in my language. I said a really small prayer at the beginning of this, because everything in Lakota begins with a prayer. All good things start with a prayer. So that teaching my own family and giving them little lessons, and now they're ready for it. So those three things, I think community is important, your own knowledge, respecting yourself, and that you may be able to impart some knowledge for future generations, and then your family, nurturing them and their interest in the language. I think those three things are really, really important. And I forgot the last part of that question. I'm sorry.
All right, thank you all for joining. Roundtables have gotten started, so y'all can head over to the lounge. Thank you, Delphine, for your wisdom and for spending time with us today. Really appreciate it. Oh,